Hi, everybody. We're continuing on with this quick detour as we continue to discuss what love is and looking at the two different words for love in the Bible in the New Testament, agape and phileo, or I'm sorry, agape and philos. Um, and we really, what we've been doing is wrestling with trying to understand love from this biblical perspective. And that's a challenge for us because the word love is loaded with a lot of baggage. Over the last several years, we have found ourselves in this ministry having to rework our understanding of words like spirit or divinity and deity because mankind and the church in particular has heaped piles of theological baggage on certain kinds of words where the biblical meaning gets lost. And to make matters worse, this word love, especially agape, um, but I'm sorry, in the English language, the word love has an entirely different dimension of baggage, which has been piled onto it, with what it means coming from, say, a psychological perspective. I would even go so far as to say is that the real biblical meaning of the word agape, has been hijacked to a certain degree. What I've been working on the last couple of weeks as we've gone through this discussion is trying to understand how to define love from two different variables. One is the nature of love, and the other one is the scope of love. And what I mean by that is this: when we see two different words for love in the New Testament, again being agape and philos, how do we understand them, especially given the fact that we're commanded to love one another? If there's a distinction, we really need to understand that. So, are they synonymous? If so, or do they differ? And if so, how do they differ? And how far does this command to love apply? Do we take the modern church view, which is that we're to show the same kind of love to all people, regardless of their faith in or obedience to God in heaven? Or does the Bible use the word in a way that implies that there would be a difference, which is really what my contention is? Does the command apply exclusively to or primarily to the fellowship? Are there nuances? Are there, different shades, if you will? And if that's true, then what is our emotional mindset supposed to be towards the unbeliever, or to make even a further distinction, the disbeliever? And in all of this, an even larger issue that I've been dealing with over the last year is what is the Christian mandate? As we are discussing and learning what it means to draw closer to God, it's really important for us to know what our priorities are. And in this discussion about understanding love really fits up into that. What is our mandate? What is our set of priorities? Back when we went through the top 10 epic fails of the modern church, we talked about the social gospel, how churches spend a lot of time and money helping non-Christians, and it's an effort to evangelize. But they do it a lot of times when they have people in their own congregation that have needs that are not being met. And as I said in that particular series, there's nothing wrong with churches having outreaches like that. But if they're doing that while they're ignoring the needs of their own brothers and sisters in their local assembly, I think there's something askew. We could say that they need to have their priorities realigned, if you will. And I think that one of the challenges that we face as a local assembly is that we live in such a homogenized and internationalized world. I can pick up my phone and call one of my, like my professional clients in Spain or in Australia and connect with them and have a conversation within 30 seconds. But in the world in which these commands to love one another and these concepts about agape and philos, the world that these were given in was anything but homogenous, anything but internationalized. Back then, if you wanted to talk to somebody who lived 50 miles away, it was a 2 to 3 day journey. So whatever you had to say better be pretty important, or that person that you wanted to talk to and see must be very special to you to make a trip like that. And this world is completely different. And so we have certain challenges in trying to understand the Bible from our modern day perspective. Back then when the gospel went out through the European continent under the apostles, they established local churches and set and appointed elders and leaders that were responsible for evangelizing and training their local communities. And if a church, say like the Philippians, had any part in supporting ministry, say in Athens, they did so by supporting Paul in his missionary journeys. And but these days, planes, trains, and automobiles and the internet have changed absolutely everything. So you and I are left trying to understand and apply old world concepts in a very new and very different world. But the concepts that we're getting from the Bible are eternal. They're eternal because God is training us for the kingdom. And I think we need to keep that in mind as we continue to study this issue of love. And I think if we were to ask ourselves, if Jesus meant for us to ignore the needs of our local assembly to prioritize the needs of unbelievers in another country, we'd be hard-pressed to substantiate that from Scripture, especially if you're using solid interpretation paradigms or techniques and being intellectually honest. But when I say things like that, I know that I run the risk of sounding heartless or lacking compassion and so on. But I said a moment ago, it's about understanding our mandate. If the Philippian church was taking care of their own and they had enough left over to support Paul, then that's fantastic. But do you really think that Paul would have accepted a denarius, a single denarius from the Philippians if he knew that they were shirking their responsibilities in their local assembly? And I would say, of course not. My point is that throughout the Old Testament and the New Testament, we see this concentric model. And I mentioned this in our meeting last week. We see this concentric model where we are to hold the local assembly and the local brethren in the highest regard, to cherish our local assembly and our brothers and sisters in that assembly above all others. And even within our local assembly, we're to make some distinctions between those who are actively seeking and growing nearer to God through humility, obedience, and reverence versus those who are a part of the assembly who are not pursuing those things. Paul said some things in 1 Corinthians chapter 5 about not mingling and not even eating or dining with those who call themselves a brother, call themselves Christians, but who are engaged in sexual immorality, which I think clearly implies this concept of a concentric model. In we're to treat disobedient Christians differently than obedient ones, for their sake, number one, to turn them back to the Lord, but also for the sake of fellowship, because Paul also says in 1 Corinthians 5 that a little leaven leavens the whole lump. This whole idea of fellowship first, and this idea of a concentric model of applying God's commands, I think is part of why God gave the Jews the law at Mount Sinai. It was a code of conduct that where God was in essence saying, like, now that you're my people, here's how I want you to treat each other, because the whole world is going to be watching. And I can't have you profaning my name and giving me a bad reputation. And it's also why Jesus gave us the Sermon on the Mount, which, as we've taught before, doesn't overturn but clarifies and augments what was being taught by the Jewish leaders of his time. And don't forget that Jesus condemned the religious leaders in the harshest of terms. I want to read a couple of things, and really what I'm doing is I'm setting some context here, because I want to establish that when you start looking, you really do see this idea of a concentric model. So I want to set that before we go back and talk about the dictionary or the lexical terms of agape and philos, and then take a look at some of the verses and the passages where these things show up. And quite honestly, this study for me has been a little bit of a rabbit trail, because there are so many different verses in different contexts where these words are used. But as you step back and start to look at them as kind of like their own body of verses and work, it really does start to become quite clear what the intent is when Jesus or the apostles used agape versus philos, or some derivative of those different words. Turn with me, if you will, just go to John 8, verse 42. This is just talking about the idea about how Jesus condemned these religious leaders. And we've seen these verses before, but just bear with me for a second. John 8:42, Jesus said to them, meaning the Pharisees, if God were your father, you would love me. And he's talking agape love. For I proceeded forth and came from God, nor have I come of myself, but he sent me. Why do you not understand my speech? Because you're not able to listen to my word. You are of your father, the devil, and the desires of your father you want to do. He was a murderer from the beginning and does not stand in the truth, because there is no truth in him. When he speaks a lie, he speaks from his own resources, for he is a liar and the father of it. But because I tell the truth, you do not believe me. Now in Matthew 23, 13 to 36, we're not going to go there. Quite honestly, I've got so many verses that I could bring out in this discussion. I'm having a hard time picking which ones that I actually want to present. But if you want to make a note, Matthew 23, verses 13 to 36, Jesus points out very specific issues with the leadership, including things that they were teaching falsely. In fact, he basically said that they were bad teachers. He called them blind. He said they were self-absorbed. He said that they taught about minutia and they ignored the weightier matters of the law, talking about justice, mercy, and faith. One could easily say that the Pharisees were Christ's enemies, especially with all the times they sought to trap him, to ensnare him, even to murder him and take his life. And so if they were his enemies, and he taught in Matthew 5 to love his enemies, why he taught us in Matthew 5 to love our enemies, why did Jesus speak to them so harshly? Was he being the hypocrite that he was accusing the Pharisees of? I do want to read a few verses in Matthew 23. Matthew 23, verse 34. Therefore, I send you prophets, wise men, and scribes. Some of them you will kill and crucify, and some of them you will scourge in your synagogues and persecute from city to city, that on you may come all the righteous blood shed on the earth, from the blood of righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah, son of Berechiah, whom you murdered between the temple and the altar. Assuredly, I say to you, all these things will come upon this generation. Now, this doesn't sound like love, does it? He's basically saying, you're all sons of the devil. You're fools. You're blind guides. You're a brood of vipers. How are you going to escape judgment? On you shall come all the righteous blood of the earth. It doesn't sound like loving his enemies. Needless to say that Jesus had a problem with how the leaders were interpreting and teaching the law, especially since they weren't true to their own words. They didn't follow their own teachings. So I want you to take that and let's go back and look at Matthew 5:43, which was one of the key verses that was brought up as potentially supporting the idea that we're supposed to agape love our enemies, being unbelievers. I dealt with a couple of those issues last week, but Matthew 5:43, you have heard it said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. Now that's one verse in the context of several different things, but we've already had that discussion last week. And if you remember last week in our local fellowship meeting, Kyle correctly pointed out that hate your enemy is not found in the Old Testament. And in fact, it turns out that particular verse has been the subject of much debate among biblical scholars going all the way back to at least the 4th century AD. So this has been kind of like a hotly contested verse for quite a long time. In essence, in Matthew 5:43, when Jesus said, you've heard it said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy, he's not countering the command of Leviticus 19:18 as if the law actually stated hate your enemy, because it doesn't. He's countering the false teaching of the Pharisees, who incorrectly interpreted and taught that love your neighbor automatically meant hate your enemy. Last week I made the point several times that the word enemy just very simply means somebody who is opposed to you. And it doesn't automatically, or it certainly doesn't always mean non-Christians. And if there's a range of ways in life that an enemy can manifest. An enemy can manifest on an interpersonal level where, as Jesus talks about, someone curses you or spitefully uses you. An enemy can appear on the national level where nations are at war with each other. But very simply, most of these commands that Jesus is talking about in the context where neighbor and enemy is being brought up is at the interpersonal level, as we discussed last week. Now, I want to go back to Leviticus 19 for a second. So you go ahead and turn there. Last week, I pointed out that in order to understand verse 18, which is the key verse, love your neighbor as yourself, In order to understand that, you had to make sure that you read verse 17. But in reality, to understand the context of neighbor and enemy, you have to go all the way back to verse 1 in chapter 19, which of course is probably not surprising to most of us. So go back again, Leviticus 19. Now, before I get there, let me tell you some things about the book of Leviticus, and this is where we're going to see very clearly in the book of Leviticus this idea of a concentric model. It's certainly not the only place it shows up, but I think it's quite evident here. First of all, at the end of the book of Exodus, right before Leviticus, we see Moses is setting up the tabernacle that they had been building during the year that they were camped at the foot of Mount Sinai. And as Leviticus opens in chapter 1 and continuing all the way through to chapter 10, God is instructing Moses and Aaron and his sons, who are to be ministers and priests in the tabernacle. In fact, the first 9 chapters detail how the priests were to handle the different kinds of sacrifices that the people brought to them under the rules that God was establishing. So before God even got to the point of instructing the general population, he was instructing Moses to instruct the high priest. In chapter 8, specifically, Moses gathers all the congregation, and what I'm going to try to do, hopefully I'm recording this in my hotel room in New York, so I've got some limited capabilities here, but I'm going to try to incorporate some of the graphics that I usually use in my PowerPoints in this video, because I've got some graphical images that will help actually explain what we're talking about here. But in chapter 8, God has Moses gather all the congregation at the door of the tabernacle of meeting. Now, logistically, this probably doesn't mean the entire nation, because you're talking about millions of people. It probably means the leaders of the different tribes. So imagine this picture. Moses and the people, they have built the temple and they're getting ready to consecrate it. And God has been instructing Moses to instruct Aaron and his sons in the priesthood on how to handle the sacrifices in the tabernacle itself. And God tells Moses, bring all the leaders because I need to do something in front of them. So we start with Moses talking to Aaron and his sons, and now we bring in the leaders of the different tribes. And in chapter 8, Moses first anoints the tabernacle itself, then he anoints the altar and all of the different implements of worship. And then in front of the leaders of the different tribes, the leaders of the entire nation, Moses takes the priestly garments that have been made and he puts them on Aaron and his sons, and he consecrates them as priests in front of the leadership. So we're seeing this inside-out progression where we're going from the tabernacle to the priesthood and then to the leadership. And then in chapter 9, Aaron and his sons offer the sacrifices that God had instructed them. And the glory of the Lord comes down and it consumes, fire comes. It's just not the glory of the Lord, but the glory of the Lord comes down. Fire comes out of heaven and it consumes the sacrifices that were sitting on the altar. And this is significant because from this point forward, the presence of God dwells within the tabernacle, of course, up until the time that God removes his presence that we see a little bit later in Israel's history. But what this does in chapter 9 is it roots the tabernacle as the focal point of Jewish life and worship, because that's where the presence of God was. Then in chapter 10, we see the story of how the 2 of Aaron's 4 sons become very excited, and they kind of get ahead of themselves. They offer what's called profane fire in front of the Lord, and God consumes them for their presumption. And then God speaks directly to Aaron, and then God speaks to Moses, and then he gives Moses further instructions for Aaron and his remaining sons who continue to act as priests. Now, chapter 11 opens like this. So I don't want to lose you because I don't have a graphic to kind of ground this conversation. But what I'm saying is that throughout the book of Leviticus, what we're seeing is the tabernacle and the presence of the Lord is the focal point. If we're looking at a concentric model, the next ring or sphere is the priesthood, the high priest and the priesthood. The next sphere outside of that is the leadership of the nation. And then the next sphere outside of that is the entire nation made up of the 12 different tribes. So now we get into chapter 11, which opens with these two verses. Now the Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron, saying to them, speak to the children of Israel, saying, and now we're getting into general instruction for the entire nation. And so notice the chain of communication. God speaks to Moses and Aaron, who are then to speak to the children of Israel, and that probably refers to the priesthood instructing the leaders of the 12 tribes, and ultimately they were to take those instructions back to the entire nation by instructing their tribes on kind of like an individual basis. And so it was an inside-out model. It was this concentric model of how God communicated with and dealt with his people. And I bring this up because this idea of the concentric model, which I've actually mentioned several different times, as I said a moment ago, God's economy places the temple at the center of the Jewish world, followed by the priesthood, then the nation's leadership, and then extending out to the general population. Jewish life centered around this concept, but it wasn't simply a model of convenience. It actually embodied a principle that carries over to our current understanding of the modern church, that everything pivots off the church. Everything pivots off the local assembly, because that's what we understand the church to be. That is another word that we had to rework our understanding of, because the church is not this universal collective, scattered believers all around the world. The church, the ecclesia, the gathering that's called out from our homes, is the local assembly itself. Right? And if you're confused on that, you can go back to, Tim's lessons in the Brains class about the church, the ecclesia, the local assembly. But, Jewish life centered around the presence of God within the tabernacle. Christian life is supposed to center around the church, the local assembly, the ecclesia, where God's presence dwells among us as the body of Christ. And it really is that simple. In fact, in Matthew 12, Jesus was told his family was there to see him, and he looked around at his disciples. He said, these are my family. These are my brothers, my sisters, and my mother, the ones who do the will of my Father in heaven. But even back in the Old Testament, this schematic, this concentric model doesn't capture some of the nuances that we can see and define by looking at the text a little bit more closely. For example, when we factor in the law itself, we know that the law was given for a few reasons. At the time, it was a national justice system that a brand new nation was to use to govern themselves, right? In the beginning, the nation of Israel was just a bunch of runaway slaves. There was no cohesion, there was no organization, there was no system of here's what's right and here's what's wrong, and the law gave that to them. Beyond that, the law was a tool that God used to allow the Jewish people to maintain a separation from the rest of the world. It was a way that the Jews could distinguish themselves as God's people among a bunch of unholy pagan nations. Some of the rules that were within the law had nothing to do with actually working out salvation, but it was a way to teach them to make distinctions between what God says is holy and what he says is profane. It was simply a training tool. But ultimately, we know from Galatians that the law was there to point the Jews to Christ, that when they realized that the law was too burdensome, that they would recognize their need for a Savior and eventually cry out to him and cry out for him. But at the time, the law was primarily the rules that individuals of the collective nation used to know what was okay to do and what was not okay to do within the context of God's economy, what was his will. And we have to recognize that very simply because of the fact that the law made provision for some people who would not follow the law. And here, think of it this way. If God expected all Jews to behave correctly just by their own inherent nature, there would be no need for the law because everyone would automatically do what was right, at least in that sense of what the role that the law was playing. So, God knowing that some would not conform, God set rules and he set consequences, specifying punishments for individuals that wouldn't conform to what God wanted. In fact, in the three books of Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers, there are close to 24 verses where God speaks directly to Moses, saying, "Speak to the children of Israel," followed by some rule and consequence for breaking that rule. And it's in this context that we see Leviticus 19:18, where God says to Moses, "Love your neighbor as yourself." And this led me to the question that I posed last week, like what does neighbor mean? Like, who is my neighbor? And the corollary to that, who is my enemy? And before we go there, I want you to know that the Hebrew and the Greek word for neighbor, the Hebrew word is rhea. It just simply means a fellow countryman. Sometimes it means somebody who lives close to you from a geographic standpoint, but there's always the implication in the Hebrew text, as well as the Greek, of being of the same nation, right? It simply can't mean whoever lives next to you without regard to ethnicity, because the Jews lived among themselves and they were commanded not to mix and mingle with other nations. So you wouldn't expect a Canaanite to be living next to a Jewish person unless that Canaanite had actually become a proselyte. One of those strangers who lived among them, who had agreed to follow the law and gone through ritual purifications. Even the Greek word for neighbor, which is plesion, goes beyond the simple location and proximity meaning to focus on being part of the same group. In fact, some of the more modern lexicons or dictionaries use the term part of the in crowd, whatever the rules are that defines whatever that particular group is, whether it's a social group or a family group or an ethnic group. And while we do know that in Jerusalem in the time of Christ, Jerusalem didn't hold Jews exclusively. Romans lived there, but most of the Romans were military. And some of the Romans who lived there were richer Romans. Some people came from other countries because they fell in love with Jerusalem, but they typically had villas and they had servants and they were secluded. So you wouldn't necessarily have this neighbor concept where you had these different ethnicities mixing with each other. So having established that context, let's go back and read Leviticus 19 verse 1. And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak to all the congregation of the children of Israel and say to them, you shall be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy. Every one of you shall revere his mother and father, and keep my Sabbaths. I am the Lord your God. Do not turn to idols, nor make for yourselves molded gods. I am the Lord your God. And if you offer a sacrifice of peace offering to the Lord, you shall offer it of your own free will." So God begins the instruction of the larger nation with personal responsibility within the nation. How to respond to God himself. Be holy because I'm holy. Don't turn to idols. Worship me of your own free will. Make it your choice. And then verse 12, he says, "Don't profane my name by swearing falsely by my name." And he tells people throughout this chapter, and even in certainly many other places and with oral tradition, he says, he tells people how to respond to others. And throughout Leviticus 19, Moses gives us a list. In verse 3, he says, "Revere your mother and your father." That's one thing that we're supposed to do. In verse 9, "When you reap the harvest of your land, you shall not wholly reap the corners of your field, nor gather the gleanings of your harvest. You shall not glean your vineyard, nor shall you gather every grape of your vineyard. You should leave them for the poor and the stranger. I am the Lord your God. You shall not steal, nor deal falsely, nor lie to one another." And one another in this context means one another in this nation that is now called Israel under God. "You shall not cheat your neighbor, nor rob him. The wages of him who was hired shall not remain with you all night until morning. You shall not curse the deaf, nor put a stumbling block before the blind, but you shall fear your God. I am the Lord. You shall do no injustice in judgment. You shall not be partial to the poor, nor honor the person of the mighty. In righteousness you shall judge your neighbor. You shall not go about as a talebearer among your people, nor shall you take a stand against the life of your neighbor. I am the Lord. You shall not hate your brother in your heart. You shall not rebuke your neighbor and not bear sin because of him. I'm sorry, you shall surely rebuke your neighbor and not bear sin because of him. You shall not take vengeance nor bear any grudge against the children of your people. And there he states specifically all these references to one another, to neighbors, is the children of your people, but you shall love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord. Furthermore, in verse 20 and 21, I'm going to try to not read too much. Verses 20 and 21 shows a man sleeping with a woman who's betrothed to another man, and then him having to be scourged and then having to bring a sin offering to the Lord, which again places the context of this entire section squarely within the realm of the nation of Israel. Therefore, the reference to neighbor is certainly people within the collective nation of Israel. So none of these terms, none of these types of people can be used to refer to anyone outside of the nation of Israel. Your neighbor, the word neighbor is referenced 4 times. Verse 15 defines your neighbor as including the poor and the person of the mighty. Verse 16 defines your neighbor as being among your people. And we see specific references to, again, your brother, the children of your people. And this does include in verse 34, 33 and 34, the stranger who dwells among you, which again would be a proselyte. Just to make sure that I'm being clear, Leviticus defines neighbor as anyone who's in your community, with community being defined not just a geographic location, but being fellow believers. So the neighbor in the Old Testament was a Jew who was rich or poor, blind or deaf, a mother, a father, a male, a female, and even included Gentiles who had converted to Judaism. Now, there are a couple of exceptions throughout the law. There are certain infractions that Moses stated led to someone being cut off from the people. That means that they were no longer a neighbor. Also, where it becomes impossible to be someone's neighbor in the sense of the way that God defines it. So God himself, in speaking to Moses to speak to the people, gives us some of these nuances. And what God is doing through the law here is defining the difference between a good neighbor and a bad neighbor. And that, in essence, is what the Bible refers to when you see these references to your enemy. Your enemy is a bad neighbor. It's someone who bears false witness. And an enemy, being a bad neighbor, is someone who does the things that a good neighbor is not supposed to do and doesn't do what a good neighbor does. And so an enemy is someone who, among the people, bears false witness, who lies, who cheats, who steals, who sleeps with your spouse, who has dishonest scales in commerce, who shows preference for the rich over the poor, who curses the deaf and causes the blind to trip over or stumble, all the way up to somebody who starts to worship idols. In essence, God defines enemy as being a bad neighbor, but he still confines the word enemy to the context of the nation of Israel. And this is the root, or it's the background, and it's the standard that Jesus is using in Matthew 5:43 when he says, love your enemy. And that's why he also said to pray for those who hate us and to scornfully use us, because they are of the brethren, but they're acting contrary to the nature, the character, and the instructions of God. Leviticus 19 says to rebuke these people so that sin doesn't enter our hearts. We need to look at people who are in the collective, they're in the fellowship, who might be our enemy because they're not being a good neighbor to us, and we need to rebuke them for 2 reasons: to try to get them back on the right path, but also to deal with the situation so we don't become bitter and now we have an issue. Now the problem is us. So, part of our mandate is to recognize the difference between somebody who is in process and under renovation. If you remember how we've talked about these concepts before, somebody who was making mistakes, but they're working their way closer to God. We have to have a lot of grace and compassion for these people. And we would probably treat that person differently than someone who, through time and proving themselves, is teetering on the edge of apostasy, and completely treating somebody different who has already left the faith. Again, we have this concentric model, and we can construct a concentric model of the brethren of the faith, the fellowship, that really parallels the Jews in the Old Testament, but relates to us as the local assembly. And again, I'll try to get this graphic for you. First of all, it starts with the core of the fellowship is the group of faithful and obedient seekers, people who are truly and actively engaged in seeking out ways to clean up their act, to clean up their character, to spend more time with God doing His will. That's the core, the faithful and the obedient seekers. And it doesn't mean they're perfect. It just means they're moving in the right direction, and they're actively engaged in that process, and they're aware that they're in that process. But also we know that within the church we have, what we might call ignorant worldly Christians. These are people who, at least from an emotional standpoint, love God. They may not love God in the sense of being really, truly obedient, but they're ignorant of this. And this is, I lay a lot of this at the feet of the unfaithful shepherds who are just not teaching the core concepts of being a disciple of Christ. Now, we all have individual responsibilities, but we have this group of ignorant worldly Christians who just don't know any better, and so they're living this mixed life. Yes, I'm a believer, but then they're doing things that they really shouldn't be doing as Christians. Then beyond that, we have what I would call the cognizant worldly Christians. These are the people who know better, and they just make the wrong choices because they like to live their lives that way. So we have our committed, faithful, obedient seekers. Then we have our ignorant worldly Christians. Then we have our cognizant worldly Christians who know better, but they're making the wrong choices. And then outside of that, we would have what I would call the doubters, the deniers, and the deceivers. And these groups of people are spoken about in different places throughout the New Testament as being part. In fact, I believe it's in Jude. It's talking about deceivers and saying that when they participate in like fellowship meals, he said that these people are spots on your love feast, and actually used the word agape in the context of defining the meal itself being a love feast. He said these people are spots on your love feast. These are people who are following their own lusts, and they are denying the Christ that saved them. Right? So again, we have this concentric model even within the fellowship, and it's all based on active engagement in that growth and renovation process, and being willing to say, okay, I'm wrong, I don't know enough, I need to learn more, I'm inconsistent here, I need to make that change, versus the other people who are just like la 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 la, and the other people who are like putting up the hand, going like, okay, sounds great, but I don't want to do that, all the way up to the people who are actively against Christ. So we have to make some distinctions even within the fellowship, right? On some, we have to have a lot of compassion, people who have good hearts and motivations, but they're learning, they're making mistakes, but they're making progress. The Bible talks about saving your brother from the fire, people who are making mistakes and they're in danger of falling away. We have to actively go after these people. But then it talks about those who are actually causing divisions within the church that the Lord will judge. These are people who are making mistakes and they're unrepentant. They're intentionally deceiving, leading people astray, and the enemy of faith. But all of this is within the context of the church itself. So, and I know it's kind of difficult here because I'm starting to run out of time, because quite honestly, there's so much to talk about. But let me get back to my core proposition, which is that the word agape, how it's defined and how it's actually used in the Bible, basically, let me say it this way. I'm proposing that we as Christians cannot agape love anybody who is not obedient to God and humble with his brothers and sisters, or his or her brothers and sisters, because that's the way the Bible uses the word agape love within the context of the fellowship. Now, I showed you a couple of verses last week where the word agape is used about non-believers. In John 3, right after John 3:16, it says that men reject darkness because they love, agape love, darkness rather than light. So agape is not used exclusively of Christians, but when it's used in the context of the fellowship, it is used exclusively of the fellowship. So again, we cannot agape love anyone who is not obedient to God and humble with the brethren. And that by necessity means that we can't agape love anyone who is not a Christian. This goes back again to my first statement, is that agape love doesn't apply to how we are to look at or treat non-Christians. Now, don't make a mistake. I don't want to be perceived as making the mistake that the Pharisees did, where it says, love your neighbor. That means we have to hate our enemies. If I say that we are not commanded to agape love the world, it does not mean we are to hate the world. That's not what I'm saying at all. And I have some distinctions in words that I'm hoping to get to, but I may have to split this up into another session. So we have to make allowances and distinctions between Christians who are making mistakes but moving forward. These people deserve our compassion and our patience, and I hope I have that from you too as I make mistakes and move forward. We have to make distinctions between Christians who are making mistakes and they're teetering on collapse. These are the ones that we have to rescue from the fire. And those making distinctions between them and the Christian pretenders who are sowing seeds of discord and disunity. We can have mercy and compassion on non-believers, but that's not agape. Those are different words. Now, agape includes or may include mercy and compassion, but mercy and compassion can be expressed outside of agape love. Maybe some of you are thinking about, especially with the talk of neighbors and people being treated poorly or well, probably thinking about the story of the Good Samaritan. Now, we're not going to go there, but if you want to read that on your own sometime, this story in the New Testament is another spot where Jesus is clarifying and refining his disciples' understanding of things that the Jews thought that they understood. And this goes to this idea of what does it mean to be a neighbor? And remember, I said earlier that the Hebrew word for neighbor either directly means or implies a countryman. But the Jews didn't consider the Samaritans to be fellow Jews, did they? They were half-breeds because once the nation split, the northern kingdoms intermixed and intermarried with the pagans in Samaria in that region, and different nations control that. And so there was a big mixture. And so they were considered half-breeds. They were considered, honestly, to be as bad as the pagan nations. But in the parable of the Good Samaritan, and you should be familiar with that story. If you're not, then find it in your Bible and read it. Jesus doesn't say, who is the neighbor? He actually uses an adverb and basically says, who acted neighborly? That's actually what the Greek says. He didn't ask, who is this guy's neighbor? He compared the people who ignored the man who had been beaten up and left for dead to the Samaritan who helped him out, and said, who acted neighborly? And in fact, Jesus didn't say that the Samaritan loved the Jew who had been victimized innocently. He didn't use the word agape. He used words that mean mercy and compassion. He's basically saying that a neighbor is someone who has mercy and compassion. And that, depending on context, can include or be part of agape love. The expectation is that if you are somebody's neighbor, that you act neighborly, with kindness, with compassion. And sometimes that's a spontaneous thing. Sometimes you have to choose to do it. Now, this begins to tease around the edges of the differences between agape and philos, the two different words that are used for love. And I'm going to try to get as much of this done as possible without going too quickly. And if I need to come back and clean things up next week, then I certainly will do that. When you look at the English word love in modern Bibles, 284 times this word appears, none of those occurrences, and I believe I mentioned this last week, but none of those occurrences are the erotic word for love, or eros from Greek. And of those 284 occurrences, some of the occurrences are verbs, some are nouns, some are adjectives, some are adverbs. For example, there is a derivative of the word philos, which means hospitable or hospitality, but it's still rooted in or related to the same root word. Only 25 of those 284 verbs, or I'm sorry, 284 occurrences are the word phileo, which is that philos type love, that brotherly type love that we commonly talk about. Most of these occurrences, 258 of the 284, come from the word agape or agapao. And a little more than half of those occurrences are the verb, and a little less than half of those are agape. So when you look at the word love in the New Testament, by far the majority is related to agape love and not to philos love or phileo type love, right? That's kind of the balance. And if we look at what we would call a distribution of these words, the word agape particularly, throughout the New Testament books, most of the occurrences of the noun form of agape love occur in the book of 1 John. The book of John has a lot, and then Paul uses it pretty frequently throughout all of his different epistles, right? So John and Paul are the most common ones, but the clear winner in terms of how many times the word agape love as a noun appears is the book of 1 John. So if you want to understand how that's used, the book of 1 John and the occurrences within that are probably a good place to start. Now the verb or the action form of agape, which is agapao, John is again the winner, clearly. And most of the action words of love occur also in the book of 1 John, but also in the Gospel of John. And this is where a lot of times Jesus is talking about, love your neighbor, love your enemy, love one another, the love that I have for you, the love I have for my Father. These are where our body of understanding really comes from. So I want to read a couple of passages before we look at definitions specifically, because I think by doing that, we can get a sense of how the apostles, particularly John, is using this. Go to John 15, verse 5. This is the parable of the vine. John 15, 5. Now, unless I tell you otherwise, all the instances of love in these passages are related to agape, right? The agape love that we've been talking about. So John 15, 5, and notice right away, as soon as we start, the context is abiding in Christ. And this goes back to my contention that the domain of agape love for us as Christians is the fellowship. That's it. It doesn't go beyond that. So verse 5 in John 15, I am the vine, you are the branches. He who abides in me and I in him bears much fruit, for without me you can do nothing. If anyone doesn't abide in me, he is cast out as a branch and is withered, and they gather them and throw them into the fire, and they are burned. If you abide in me and my words abide in you, you will ask what you desire, and it shall be done for you. By this my Father is glorified, that you bear much fruit, so you shall be my disciples. As the Father loved me, and again, all agape love, as the Father loved me, I also have loved you. Abide in my love. If you keep my commandments, you will abide in my love, just as I have kept my Father's commandments and abide in his love. These things I have spoken to you, that my joy may remain in you, and that your joy may be full. Now, right away, John here records Jesus as equating loving him with obedience. We've talked about this before, right? Loving God leads you to obedience, and if you are not obedient to God, you're not loving God. You're certainly not agape loving him. Now, Jesus starts to switch focus. He just said, if you love me, you'll obey me. And then he says this in verse 12, this is my commandment, that you love one another as I have loved you. Now, the general context is abiding in him, being branches that are still connected to the vine. And he commands his branches to love other branches, love the other branches that are connected to the vine. And there's no room here for us to extend this command to love to either branches who have been cut off and tossed away to be burned in the fire, or branches of other trees that are not connected to the true vine. There's no room to make that application. He continues on, verse 13, greater love, agape, has no one than this, than to lay down one's life for his friends. Now, interestingly, the word friend is a noun which is a derivative of the word philos, or philos. So greater love has no one than this, than to lay down one's life for his friends. You are my friends, if you do whatever I command you. So now Jesus starts to use both words, or words that are derived from the same roots, together. He says that the greatest expression of agape love on a human-to-human level is for someone to die for a friend. Now, he's already established that the love between human to human within the context of the fellowship is one branch loving another branch. We're still connected to the vine. We're still part of the fellowship. But he says that the greatest expression of love is for a friend to die for a friend, friends that love each other. And what Jesus is getting at here is that, he was going to die for them. And while some would give their life for him, what he required is obedience. That was how they were to express their love for him. He's not making any great doctrinal statements here. He uses the word friend for the first time with them, and he starts to begin to signal a change in the nature of their relationship. In verse 15, he says this. He says, no longer do I call you servants, for a servant doesn't know what his master is doing, but I have called you friends. For all the things that I heard from my Father I've made known to you. You didn't choose me, but I chose you and appointed you that you should go and bear fruit, and that your fruit should remain, that whatever you ask the Father in my name, he may give you. These things I command you, that you love, and that's agape love, one another. And all of the context is abiding in him, sharing this faith, being unified, loving each other, and being obedient to him by being at least willing to respect each other. Now, let me see if I want to go through this. Yeah, let me read this one here. Go to 1 John chapter 3. 1 John chapter 3. Verse 10. And again, all the instances are agape love. On your own, read all the way down through 23, but just for the sake of time, I'm going to read a shorter clip of this. Verse 10, in this the children of God and the children of the devil are manifest. Whoever does not practice righteousness is not of God, nor is he who does not love his brother. For this is the message that you heard from the beginning, that we should love one another, not as Cain, who was of the wicked one and murdered his brother. And why did he murder him? Because his works were evil and his brother's righteous. Do not marvel, my brethren, if the world hates you. And this is the key verse here. We know that we have passed from death to life because we love the brethren. He who does not love his brother abides in death. Verse 16. By this we know love, because he laid down his life for us, and we also ought to lay down our lives for the brethren. Again, the context is still squarely within the fellowship, the people who are united by their relationship with and their love for Christ and the Father. There's no way around it. There's no way to insert anything else or anyone else in there. Let me skip a couple of things that I've got here. Let me just give you some references if you want to go read more. And really these just belabor the same point. But 1 John 4 verse 7, all the way through to chapter 5 verse 5. So 1 John 4:7 to 1 John 5:5. Go ahead and read those on your own time. But I do want to show you this one. Go to 1 Peter 1. 1 Peter 1. I'm going to cut some of these verses short because I do want to get to the definitions here in a second. So 1 Peter 1:22 says, since you have purified your souls in obeying the truth through the Spirit in sincere love of the brethren, love one another fervently with a pure heart, having been born again, not of corruptible seed, but incorruptible, through the word of God which lives and abides forever. Now this is an interesting statement from Peter, because he uses the word agape or agapao, where he says, love one another fervently with a pure heart. But then he says, love of the brethren. And this is not simply the word philos. It's a derivative of that, and basically it's Philadelphia, which is a compound word, which is a delphos philos, which is literally love of brother. So we have one sin. There's several different places. There's not many, but there are a handful of verses in the New Testament that use both words related to philos and agape together. This is one of them. So let me read it again. Since you have purified your souls in obeying the truth through the Spirit in sincere love of the brethren, agape love one another fervently in your heart. Now go to 1 Peter chapter 2. So I'm trying to find my place here. Oh, let me read from verse 9. I'm just setting context here. But you are a chosen generation, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, his own special people, that you may proclaim the praises of him who called you out of darkness into his marvelous light, who once were not a people, but are now the people of God, who had not obtained mercy, but now had not obtained mercy, but now have obtained mercy. Now there can be no question that he's talking about the fellowship of believers. Beloved, I beg you, as sojourners and pilgrims, abstain from fleshly lusts that war against the soul, having your conduct honorable among the nations. Now, in this discussion, I think one of the questions that we have to answer, if we are not to agape love non-believers, what are we to do? Well, Peter tells us one here. Have your conduct honorable among them, so that when they speak against you as evildoers, they may, by your good works, and that phrase good works literally means basically honorable deeds, which they observe, by observing these things, that they would glorify God in the day of visitation. Therefore, submit yourselves to every ordinance of man for the Lord's sake, whether to the king as supreme, or to governors as to those who are sent by him for the punishment of evildoers, for the praise of those who do good. For this is the will of God, that by doing good you may put to silence the ignorance of foolish men, as free, yet not using liberty as a cloak for vice, but as bondservants of God. And this is the key verse here, because I think this answers the question, if we are not to agape love non-believers, how are we to think of them or act towards them or feel towards them? So verse 17 says, honor all people. Love the brotherhood, and that is agape love. Fear God, honor the king. Now, I'm going to retract what I said earlier. I'm going to just explain a few things, then we're going to cut it off here because I don't want to run the risk of going too far over. But I think that this is fruitful for discussion next week when we come together. So let me just point out a few things here. Honor all people. This word honor in Greek is time, and it's basically rooted in the concept of value. And it often relates to material things, and it can be related to assigning a price to something, like a good or a service. But we know that honor can be among humans, and according to all of the reference texts that I've looked through in trying to understand these words, honor among humans is based on several different things. It can be based on merit. It can be based on position. It can be based on authority. It can be based on authority within certain relationships. For example, we're commanded to honor our mother and our father. Peter here says, honor the king, right? We're supposed to honor those who are in authority from, for example, a civic relationship or a civic organization. This word honor or time is sometimes translated as respect. And in one of the more commonly used Greek dictionaries or lexicons called the Lounaida lexicon, works on a concept called semantic domain. So basically it kind of groups words that are all related together so you can get a bigger sense rather than focusing on each individual word. It talks about word groups, and basically Lounaida reference places the word time in the semantic domain of honor and respect and esteem. So Peter tells us to honor all people and the king. Of course, the king in this context is not a Jew, because he's talking about the authorities that are in control of Jerusalem at the time, which would have been, the Assyrian or the Syrian king. In saying honor all people and honor the king, he makes no distinction between believer versus unbeliever, yet he says specifically to agape love the brethren. Honor all people, agape love the brothers and the sisters. And this is significant because, again, it begins to help us understand the distinction between love and things like respect. We can respect somebody, we can have compassion, we can display mercy without loving them in the sense that we are commanded to love the brethren. And I think we often confuse those because we tend to lump them together, and because of the way love is being used in our modern language. The love of the brethren, the agape love of the brethren, is reserved in the Bible for those who are of the family of God, including those fellow believers who are not treating you well. In other words, your enemies. So here's a final question before we sign off just for today, and we will have to continue this discussion next week. What if a non-believer is acting like an enemy? Jesus said, love your enemies. So if a non-believer is acting like an enemy, are we required to agape love them? And the answer is no, because the agape loving your enemy, is talking about loving your brothers and sisters who are not treating you properly. But we are to treat a non-believing enemy with respect. Perhaps we are even to have compassion on them, because as we know, and this is kind of a quaint saying, but hurting people hurt other people. We also are not to take vengeance on them just because they're an unbeliever. It's like, oh, I can't take vengeance on a brother, but man, if you're not a brother, look out. But the Bible, the way I see it, the way I read these, we are not to love them in the way that is to be reserved for true believers and true followers of Christ. Now, next week, I'm going to open up the floor to discussion for anything that I've said today's lesson or last lesson. And I apologize if I went through. I was really trying to cover a lot of ground today. So I hope I didn't confuse anybody by going at a rapid pace. But what we'll do next time is we'll actually look at the definitions of these words, philos and agape or agapao. And we're going to look at the many sides, because these words are used in different ways in different contexts. Of course, there's all kinds of different derivatives, but we'll take a look in depth at the words phileo and the words agape, just to make sure that we understand them and come away with a good solid biblical understanding. And really, that's my only goal. My only goal is to understand these words as they were intended, which means I can understand the commands that I'm supposed to follow, right? And I pray the same thing for you. Miss you guys. Wish I was there, and I'll see you next week. Take care.